Helen Haynes likes to say at the start of meetings, let's not punish the punctual. Let's get cracking. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. This is the first town hall of the year. Been doing a town hall every quarter, sort of moving it around the territory and really focusing on different issues that are either, I guess, in the news at the time or something that I think is important to everyone. And clearly this one on cost of living is something that everyone's obviously talking about a lot, but people are really feeling it. And so really trying to look at what can we do both now, but also more longer term to actually ensure that we're dealing with some of the root causes of this. So I'd like to acknowledge we're a Ngunnawal country. Love living in this part of the world and want to pay respects to elders past and present and thank them for their continuing custodianship and just how generously they share this land with us. There's a lot to talk about tonight. Very lucky and thankful that Genevieve Jacobs, the CEO of Hands Across Canberra, and Dr. Devin Bowles, CEO of ACCOS, have agreed to come along and speak. We'll hear from them, from both of them, and I'll then give a bit of an update, what I'm hearing, I guess the lay of the land, what myself and my team have been working on, and then, as always, we'll go to a Q&A. Over the past day, we have had, is that the Slido? Yeah, Slido open, which just makes it easier to upload a question and then upvote it. So we're dealing with the most popular questions to start with, but we'll then just open it up and people can ask questions. I think that's how we're gonna do it. Sorry if we had another plan. So first up, I'm going to invite Genevieve Jacobs, who has been incredibly busy ahead of Canberra Day, to come and chat about the impact of the cost of living crisis on the Canberra community.
Well, thank you, and good evening, everyone. And I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this place, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. I've actually never been to the Gungahlin Library before, but I was led by the smell of sausages. It's a very clear indicator. It's a great pleasure to participate in this with Senator Pocock and my colleague Devin Bowles, particularly, as Dave says, we are in the midst of the Canberra Day appeal, where we try to throw sharp focus on the work of hundreds of local charities who are meeting need in the ACT. Now, that need is very real. You'll often hear me refer to the 40,000 Canberrans who live in poverty and around 10,000 children among them. The level of hunger here in Canberra, which is growing significantly, and the effect of what I call the Canberra cliff, which is what happens when a city is predominantly financially very secure. The majority of people in Canberra range from being quite comfortable to very well off indeed. You fall off the edge, something happens in your life, and you'll face very, very high cost of living pressures. It's a long way from that big comfortable plateau down to the bottom of the cliff. And one of the points I want to make about this is that those pressures can affect people who do not look on the surface as if they are struggling. I heard this week of a young woman who said she was earning around about $120,000 a year, a single parent, and she said, every month I need help from family members. Every month. Now, $120,000 a year would have sounded like an absolute fortune as a salary only a couple of years ago, but that's the kind of cliff that I'm talking about. Devin's going to have more facts and more figures because that analysis and advocacy is really his field. But I wanted to give you some measures about how the need is hitting. We're right in the middle now of our expressions of interest for the annual grants round we do at Hands Across Canberra between ourselves and the Snow Foundation and the John James Foundation. And we give out around about $1.5 million each year between us in that major grants round. So I had a look last night at the applications. They are the highest they have ever been. For this round, we have 194 expressions of interest, and this is after sifting out all the small applications for, $1,000 or $2,000 or less. The total amount requested is $11.5 million of help that people are asking for, and that's $1 million more than it was last year. We can break that down by the areas of need, and that gives us some really interesting indicators about where the pressure points are. Interestingly, strengthening engagement and belonging requests have doubled in dollar terms by comparison to last year. So that is about loneliness, it's about isolation, it's about lack of support when people are struggling, lack of networks for people to turn to. And that's not only aligned, of course, with social status or economic need either. Interestingly, requests for funding on mental health have decreased a little. That's likely a sort of a post-pandemic effect ending, but we've still got really strong calls for help on disability and healthcare, family and domestic violence issues, and at-risk youth. And lots of those are really clearly connected back to the pressures that are exerted by costs of living and the pressure that puts on family structures. And it has some extraordinary and quite distressing consequences. One of my current missions is to get support for a food bank facility in Canberra because we are seeing steadily increasing demand. And school food programs, school pantries, street pantries are trying to meet need. When they're dealing with people who are fully employed but still needing help to feed their families, particularly where there's an intersection with issues like disability or domestic violence. And that's one of the key points that I want to make about how the cost of living pressures are affecting our community. What happens when you live in an expensive city, a city with high cost of living pressures, and then those cost of living pressures hit families who are already funding, for example, disability support services for their children, or when families who are impacted by domestic violence seek safety and they go from 2 incomes to 1 or less. When you look at the bills and you say, I'm spending X dollars on early intervention for my 2 kids on the autism spectrum, I'm trying to keep our family stable by staying in our nice familiar home, even though there may have been a breakup in the family. So actually, I find that I have no money to buy fresh vegetables. And down the track, that'll mean my kids, who are already living with a disability, might have compromised health, might have bad teeth, for example, because of course we know that dental care is not covered by Medicare. What does that do then to their chances of holding down a decent job, to their future? It's this awful cycle that builds and builds and builds. And people who may well be fully employed, holding down 2 or 3 jobs, can find themselves in a position where they're choosing between bread and rent, because the rent is so expensive, and you're trying to provide stability for your kids and trying to provide stability for the future. So what do we do about it? It's fairly common in Australia to say the government should do something about it. And yeah, they should. Government is responsible for the policies that create a fairer nation, and we need to sharpen their focus, both here in the ACT and federally, on equity and dignity for all of us, to ensure that the government is governing for everyone. And I've got no doubt that our Senator will have something to say about this. But I also want to talk about how policies can help us build a stronger community sector. As I said, many of you will be aware that we're currently fundraising for the Canberra Day Appeal and hundreds of local charities. But I really want to make that community foundation one of the key tools for working on cost of living pressures and the kind of need we see in our community. If I can really get this community foundation moving, there's a much bigger potential that turns government into a partner and helps put the answers in the community's hand. So very briefly, in places like Canada, where community foundations are well established, a city like Canberra would have a foundation with maybe $100 million invested, a lot of money for community building. It becomes about more than grants to charities, but the cornerstone of a civil society, because the foundation can start investing in solving major problems in partnership with government. So the projects and the potential becomes bigger. You tackle, for example, not grants for charities, but youth homelessness itself, or creating employment in the disability sector through founding social enterprises or providing a whole social enterprise hub. I don't actually want us to be entirely dependent on the government to solve every problem. Here in the ACT, that will frankly always be pretty small change because the revenue base for the ACT government is always going to be quite small. Instead, I want it to be easier for governments to form partnerships with us all, where the whole community determines the path forwards together, rather than being at the beck and call of short-term political agendas. I actually think we can be better and stronger that way. I think we can meet the need I've just described better. It's a really significant shift in thinking, but there is some huge potential there. Very happy to talk until the cows come home about this, but that's not why you're here. Please think it over. Donate to canberraday.org.au and let's look at all the ways we can build a stronger, better Canberra together. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Genevieve, and thanks again for your work with Hands Across Canberra and the focus on actually looking after our own backyard. And I would encourage people to look up community foundations and the work that you're doing, trying to bring that to the ACT. Amazing success in Canada, some really cool examples. Next up, we'll hear from Dr. Devin. As I said, ACOS CEO, really on the front line of you talk cost of living. Thanks for the work that you and your team do. We're going to hear more about the impact on the ground on social services.
Well, thank you, Senator, and thank you for organising a town hall on what really is an absolutely vital subject, as well as for the invitation. Now, ACOS operates at the ACT level, so I hope it's understood that my attendance and comments here in no way detract from ACOS's strict party political independence. Now, if you're here, I think you already understand that cost of living pressures are creating a huge amount of hardship in the ACT. And I think it'll be no surprise either that demand for community services is increasing substantially. And this really comes from two levers. The first is that the cohorts that have been supported by the community sector for decades are finding themselves in even greater need. And so an individual that's previously relied on the community sector for one type of assistance is perhaps needing 2 or 3 types of assistance now. And complexity in individual clients' lives makes it harder to deliver services effectively. So think, for example, of someone who's receiving mental health care in the community. The ability to help a person manage their own mental health becomes very much degraded when that person is experiencing insecure housing due to diminished or because of increased cost of living pressures. But there's this second phenomenon, which is that there are whole new cohorts of people requiring assistance who didn't before. And so Genevieve, you spoke of food pantries, and some recent analysis suggests that the average food pantry is seeing 25% more people than they were just a year ago. Some of them, it's up to 75% more. And what they're seeing is that it is people who are employed, who have never gone to a food pantry before, sometimes even people from dual income families. Now, in this context, the ACT government is the largest funder of the many community services. And yet, even as need for the community sector services has increased, support from government as a proportion of its overall budget expenditure has decreased. So between 2009-10 and 2022-23, the community sector experienced a 30% decline in the proportion of the budget that it received. To put that in perspective or another way, spending on the community sector has been well behind population growth. The increase in real terms has been about half as fast as population growth, even as government has increased its overall expenditure, doing very reasonable things like building infrastructure for a growing population. So it's not going to surprise you that ACCOS, as the peak body for the community sector, is calling for more funding for the community sector from government, recognizing absolutely the constraints that they're under, but also recognizing that really the only way out of deficit is to invest more in upstream services that keep people out of hospitals. So that sort of investment is often done best in the community sector. So what I've said so far I think won't be of a great surprise to you, but it might be more surprising that I'm going to say that actually funding for the community sector is not anything like the whole answer. Because underlying all of this is a long-term trend in Australia towards widening wealth inequality. So right now, the highest 20% of income earners make twice as much as the middle 20%, and 5 times as much as the average in the lowest 20%. That sounds extreme, but when we look at overall wealth, it becomes much more extreme. So the wealthiest 20% have, on average, more than 5 times as much wealth as the middle 20% of the population, and about 90 times the wealth of the average person in the lowest 20%. Now, this matters a lot. Australians, according to OECD research, think 69% of us think that the differences in income are too large. But I think even this does not fully capture the extent of the problem. And so the stakes, I would argue, are higher. You can hear I have a bit of an accent. And we're currently watching the US political system implode. How did America get there? I would argue that it is because half the population saw that it did not have a stake in the economic and political status quo. And so when a candidate for president came along and said, very clearly, I'm going to overturn the game board, a lot of people said, yeah, I don't have anything to lose from that. That's totally reasonable. I would argue that the United States, which has higher levels of income inequality than Australia, in fact, among the highest in the world, got to where it is because of a long-term slip in income equality, which in many respects is the same as increasing cost of living pressures for the average person. So the solution, I think, relies partly on the community sector, but I think there are also some big government decisions to make around how government gets income and how government spends income. And so partly it's about who we tax, how much we tax them, but also how we distribute benefits. So there are some quick wins here, including raising the rate on income support so that people on job seeker and youth allowance have something like what people on the pension get, $80 a day, increasing rent assistance, and increasing the public housing infrastructure, which over the last decades has declined significantly in the ACT and indeed across the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Devin. Sobering thinking about the trend around inequality and just how it just doesn't line up with what most Australians want in terms of an egalitarian society where it doesn't matter, who your parents are. You can make your way in life, and I agree, some big decisions to be made. I thought I'd quickly just go through a few things around what I'm hearing. This was a survey done last year, And you'll see cost of living was number 4 behind climate, housing, healthcare. I think the thing with housing, though, is that it very much underpins the cost of living crisis. If you look at Australians' earnings, we actually do pretty well if you compare them to other countries. It's just we have this insane housing system that is not set up as something that should be affordable and accessible more as a human right. It's set up as an investment vehicle. And if that's how we set it up, it's actually working quite well. I'd argue that it's not actually working well for Australians, and I think it needs to change. Healthcare too, obviously some unique challenges here in the ACT around access and affordability and gap payments and all those sorts of things that we've been pushing hard on, and a bit of a thorny issue because there is so much crossover between federal and territory. But if we go to... Oh, this is a bit more feedback. And again, like I think it kind of just shows how cost of living really is cutting across all these other issues, health, housing, young people's anxiety about their futures when they look at housing and what it's going to mean for them. You know, people in their 20s and 30s thinking about having families, what it means for them. So, I think a huge amount to do in Parliament to actually show some leadership and start to deal with these problems. Next one. Put this one up because one of my concerns over the past 3 years, seeing how Parliament works or doesn't work up close, is that there's very little being done or very little appetite to actually deal with some of the root causes of the challenges we're facing, whether that's climate, housing, cost of living. There's a real focus on, okay, what are some short-term measures that we can announce and say we're doing something. To actually deal with root causes, you actually have to upset some vested interests, people who are benefiting from the current system. And if you look at climate, we know who they are. If you look at cost of living, you just have to look around and look at how little competition we have in so many sectors of our economy and just how wildly profitable these companies have been, making billions and billions of dollars while Australians are doing it tough. You have to say, well, that's not actually working for us. Again, I think the thing I'm hearing from Canberrans is that there's more and more appetite for some bigger changes, sensible changes, but I think changes that are long overdue. I wanted to bring this up. So that was last year's survey. What we're finding, door knocking, and thank you so much. We've got so many incredible volunteers who are getting involved leading into the election and have been involved in the last 3 years in both of my offices, Parliament House and here in Gungahlin. Cost of living now seems to be the number one thing. Like, as Devin was saying, you know, just in the last year, 25, some food pantries, 75% increase. People are really feeling it. This is some feedback of what is coming in on emails. So we get, I think, between 1,000 and 2,000 emails a month from Canberrans about specific issues, ideas, and again, some great stuff. One of the things that myself and other crossbenchers have been pushing hard is household and business electrification. It's a way to actually save money every year into the future. It's not a one-off $300 energy rebate. It's thousands of dollars a year, and we have that technology ready for us, and we've been pushing for programs to actually ensure that people aren't left behind, and we can have that rolled out. I've talked about competition, scam protection. In the last week of Parliament, we saw the major parties team up on electoral reform or donation reform to really entrench the duopoly. Not a single, actually maybe one crossbench in the lower house voted for it, but no one else voted for it. Terrible deal, and from next election, it'll make it incredibly hard for independents to get elected. But what they also did at the same time was rammed through scams legislation, which was roundly criticised by consumer groups, by people who'd been scammed, as not actually protecting Australians. The model that had been suggested was actually a reimbursement model, where if you haven't been negligent as an Australian, the bank just reimburses you, and then they work with, say you got it was a text message scam or a scam on Facebook, they then work with those companies to work out, okay, well, how do we apportion the blame here, and then they can go after the scammers. They ended up, both major parties, just letting this legislation go through, which will be ineffective and basically puts the onus on you to prove how you've been scammed, why you should be reimbursed, and everything we saw. It could be a year-long process to actually get money back. So that was very disappointing, and I think something that we all know, scamming's kind of gone from something that we just think happens to all the numpties out there, not us, to something that we know we're all vulnerable to. People are getting a lot better, particularly with generative AI coming into play. When I talk to uni students, paid pracs is something that gets raised a lot. You just can't pay the bills when you're expected to do 1,000 hours of prac. What are you meant to do to your jobs that are helping you get you through uni? Increasing the rate of things like job seeker, of youth allowance. They're currently below the poverty line, and that's just a political choice as a country. I think we should all be proud that we have a safety net, but I think it should be something that's above the poverty line. Job-ready graduates, for anyone who's recently gone through uni and done an arts degree, you'll know that you're looking at 40, 50 grand now due to Scott Morrison's changes. Widely criticised, it's not working. Young people don't make the decision on what to study based on how much it's going to cost. They decide what they want to study based on what they love, and I think that's a good thing to do. That needs to change. Unfortunately, it hasn't. And then we've heard a lot of talk about reforming HECS, and the government saying if they get re-elected, 20% off HECS. One of the, I think, more practical things is actually to change the date of HECS indexation. So currently, you get charged indexation or interest on 11 months of payments that you've already made to the ATO, which just seems extraordinary. And this has been going on forever. And so we've been pushing for that to change. Healthcare again, doing a lot of work on GPs, which is really the federal part of healthcare in the ACT. Some policy progress. Myself and other crossbenchers managed to get an agreement with the government to roll out electrification pilots in every state and territory. So you're looking at like 1,000 households in a suburb, really to work through some of the big issues in terms of regulation and to show that this can work, this technology is here. So that was a lot of work a lot of work to get that done, but yeah, really, really happy to see it happen. We've seen multiple increases to the safety net payments. That was based off recommendations from the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee, which was a commitment from government that I got in 2022. We've seen some bulk billing stuff. Again, it needs to work for the ACT. Everything we've seen says that it probably won't, so we'll continue to push them for a tailored solution. We've talked about HECS. Abolishing the activity test was very welcome. It's a good move towards evidence-based policy. And one of the other things which I found astounding is the airline industry and just the duopoly in there and how much we're all getting ripped off. And so negotiated some extra money for the ACCC to monitor them, but clearly I think there's so much more work to do there. So going forward, I think I've touched on a bunch of these. These are some of the policy priorities that we're continuing to push with the government in the Parliament. You can check them out on the screen. On top of that, I've got a whole range of private senators' bills, from a duty of care to young people and future generations on climate, to actually requiring the government of the day to have a housing and homelessness plan, which seems pretty nuts that we don't have one as a country. It's backed in by over 100 experts and organisations who work on housing and homelessness, and I think it would probably be a good start if you want to try and solve a crisis to have a plan. But we'll continue to push that. So maybe let's go to some questions. We'll go straight to Slido, Tash.
So the guys are just going to get a couple of Slido questions up that folks have been submitting over the past 24 hours or so. And then people have been voting on the most popular ones that they wanted to see answered. So the first one is, do you support a Medicare-style approach for dental services in Australia to alleviate cost of living pressures on households, especially pensioners?
This is something that does get raised quite a bit. I think we have to look at ways to include dental in Medicare. The thing that comes back from the major parties is, well, we can't afford it. And so I guess that comes down to our tax system. My response to them is almost always, well, until you start actually getting some revenue from our gas exports, I don't want to hear that argument. I don't want to hear that we don't have money for this or that. So I think it really is about priorities. And maybe, Devin, if you want to jump in on this, I think some people who can't afford to see a dentist maybe just think, oh, well, it's just dental, but I think it's so fundamental.
No, the fact that Australia has Medicare is great. As someone who came from America, I really value it. But as a health professional, there's no biological reason that part of your health gets covered by government, but then when you get to your mouth, it stops. And, the evidence is really clear that poor oral health affects overall health, not least mental health, but also poor oral health increases your risk of a heart attack. I mean, there's absolutely no reason to draw a line between the two. And in terms of social mobility, we know that access to dental care is really useful for helping people to have the confidence when they've had poor oral health to, sometimes engage in employment where they haven't before, or engage in their community in ways that they haven't before. So absolutely support that.
I think it's a link that's not often made, but it's very hard to get a job if your mouth is full of rotting teeth. It just is. And as Devin said, your teeth are part of your body. It's an intrinsic part of your body. It just is bizarre that we've made that separation, and that those long-term consequences that flow from poverty, from bad diet, from lack of dental health, into people's chances of going into full employment, into their chances of going into white-collar, more highly remunerated employment rather than necessarily doing labouring work, all those things are consequential, and they're things that we just don't tap out when we look at the trace of how that works out through the community.
The next online question was, how can we get back to improving things for folks with lower incomes, plus those on pensions and New Start?
Sorry, say that again. I was reading these ones.
What's that?
What was it?
How can we get, it's the second one up there, how can we get back to improving things for folks with lower incomes, plus those on pensions and New Start?
Well, again, I think we've just got to have a social security system that actually keeps people above the poverty line. It seems like a fairly basic thing for me. Like we recognise that we want to be a society where everyone is able to live a life of dignity, and surely that's being above the poverty line. And one of my frustrations is that we've seen with the last few years with interest rates, you hear economists all the time talking about, well, we actually need unemployment to go up a bit. so that interest rates can come back down. And yet we hear politicians saying, well, they're just a bunch of leaners. You know, we want lifters, not leaners. So, well, which one is it? Are these people actually playing an important part in our current economic system, or are they just leeches? And I think it's a really unhelpful way of framing this debate. And the other argument that gets put up is, well, if you raise things like job seeker, then no one's going to work. We actually saw during COVID, when job seeker was doubled, that a lot of people actually got off job seeker and found employment because they weren't just chronically stressed about how they were going to put food on the table, or, you know, buy textbooks for their kids, or whatever it might be. So, I don't know, Devin, you're the expert on this one.
Well, I'm going to take a very non-expert point of view and say, on some level, the solution is seeing other people as people and recognizing the humanity of other people. And I think when we do that individually, we're really generous. But when a group of people is sort of cast as an other, it's much easier to say, oh, you know, if we lift them out of poverty with income support, they won't work because they're inherently lazy. Even though people, when they think about themselves, well, if income support were just above the poverty line, how many people would say, oh, well, yeah, I'm just going to retire now? Probably not many of us. I think also, though, the role of rising inequality makes us less likely to see the humanity in each other. So there's good evidence that the more stratified a society is, the more class anxiety people have, and the more overall anxiety people have, because they can see no matter where they are on that hierarchy, either they're at the bottom, in which case life's terrible, or they're closer to the top, but they see how far there is to fall. And that pervasive anxiety, I think, is one of the primary things that stops us from seeing the humanity in each other. And so I guess what I'd say is that this is a really important thing to tackle, and that if we don't tackle it, it's going to get harder. And that's partly because of the dynamic that I just said, but it's also because, and you can see this in America, as wealth concentrates and power concentrates, the people at the top have more means at their disposal to get people to vote against their own interests, to solidify their elite positions.
I just wanted to add, if I could, some of you might have seen this, I wrote an opinion piece which has been published on the Riot Act today about the current challenges to diversity and inclusion, and this goes towards this idea of giving people a fair go and giving people a leg up to make their way forward. We're seeing a lot of challenges at the moment about supposed favours being done to people, and it's often people who have low incomes, it's people who come from different backgrounds, people who are stressed in some way or another, refugees, migrants, women, people of colour, all those kinds of things. And what we hear is, look, let's stop doing people those favours. It's just woke nonsense. And I think to myself, aren't we just trying to give people a fair go? Isn't that what this is all about? That we are all stronger and better when we give everyone the opportunity to use their intellectual capital? Aren't we better as a nation when everyone has the chance to have an education, everyone has the chance to grow up in a home where there's enough money to feed the kids, for people to be clothed appropriately, to be educated freely, and then those people build the next generation? That seems to me like common sense. And when we stratify the community in this extraordinary way and we say that there's this bunch of people at the bottom that are just completely hopeless and we're not interested in them and they don't deserve to have the means of keeping themselves and their family together, then is it any less likely that those people would not also have something to give to this country? It's stupid. It's a waste of resources. It's false economics. And I think it's really regrettable if we depart from the Australian values of the fair go and we start stepping into this world of everyone's an other, everyone's someone that doesn't deserve to be seen as a human being.
And maybe just finally, like structurally, one of the things on that question, which was the reason why on industrial relations, the first round with the government, one of the things I negotiated was a legislated Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee that actually independently did this work and said, what should the level of things like job seeker, youth allowance be for people to be able to live above the poverty line and get back into work and continue to contribute? And that now gets released 2 weeks before the budget, so we can see, well, this is what all the experts say, including, Business Council of Australia, union movement. So you've got people around the table, and then we get to see what the government actually prioritises.
Do you want to go to questions in the room?
Sure.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Senator. For the past couple of years, the Labor government has been bragging that they've been able to put the budget in black, meaning they are now taking money and paying back down foreign debt. Do you believe that there will be a better use of the money used to pay down foreign debt to invest back into Australia, such as raising New Start and JobSeeker?
It's a really good question because I think there's really strong arguments on both sides that over the long term we'll have more money to actually spend on Australians if we don't have so much debt and we're not spending a lot of money repaying debt. I was quite critical of the government boasting about their surplus at a time where they decided not to raise things like JobSeeker. And I think at a time where so many Australians who have jobs, some families who have 2 incomes are doing it tough. I think we can't lose sight of people who are actually, truly doing it tough. And you just have to go down to any of the shopping centres in Canberra now. Go down to Dixon shops and see what's happening to our society. So again, I'd probably come back to the question of the government around revenue. Like, why do we give our gas away for free to these multinationals? Why do we allow Meta, Google, all these companies to profit shift and take in billions of dollars worth of advertising revenue from Australian companies and then say, well, actually, we've got to pay our parent company overseas and we didn't make a profit? It's frankly ridiculous. And so I think there's a huge number of revenue streams that we could be actually tapping into to pay for things like that and also pay down some debt.
I just wanted to add with those figures I mentioned earlier on about the 40,000 people in Canberra who live in poverty and 10,000 of them being children. I had a real challenge when I wrote about this a little while ago, and someone said, well, 3.5% employment and 450,000 people and, your figures don't add up. And on that point about New Start and how low it is, well, they do add up because quite a number of the people living in poverty are in full employment. They're working in 2 to 3 jobs. And if they are living effectively in poverty, what does that mean about the people who are on New Start? That is a huge indicator that you can live significantly in poverty while working your guts out in full employment and, according to various people in various governments, being a great citizen and still not being able to feed your kids.
Yeah, I've spoken to a guy who has a full-time job, works and lives in his car. Someone else who works at Canberra Hospital lives in the caravan park. I think this is the reality of a lot of Canberrans. Natasha.
Hi there. I'd just like to add something to the idea about housing. We all tend to forget that many years ago there used to be lots and lots of hostels so that people moving cities, not sure what was going to happen, leaving homes, breaking up relationships, could move into a hostel. They don't have to have their own bathroom, their own kitchen. Lots of people can live very well in a hostel, and I think we should be building more of those. So that's just an idea to put out there. Thanks.
Thank you. Something that Senator Jackie Lambie from Tasmania has talked a bit about in the Parliament, actually, saying that she thinks there is a role for that.
Yeah.
I like the question about housing. If you look around, there are many, many lower cost dwelling opportunities that I've not heard talked about in this country at all. There are companies that offer you a transportable, not a trailer with wheels on it, a building that could be 35 or 50 square meters. It doesn't require a 350 square meter block of land. You could probably put 10 of them there. Yet we have small blocks of land with 30 square houses on them. Next point I wanted to make, there are enormous bit of evidence about how many people volunteer in Australia. I'm one of those people. I've been retired for 20 years. I volunteer all over the place.
You are a treasure then. You are an absolute treasure.
But there is no recognition other than the Volunteer of the Year for tradespeople, for people who are working not tough, they're working well. They're starting small business. There's not enough publicity, recognition, talk about that. The ABC, people listen a lot about the ABC. It's all over the place. It's like a shotgun approach every morning. I'm glad Ross is back, but gee, I wish there'd be some more focus. And the other thing that I wanted to say is, I saw 15 years ago, I walked into a car dealership. They had a $1.3 million car on the showroom floor. I said, what is this doing here? I was told there are a dozen people in Canberra who could walk in today and pick it up and walk away. And Dick Smith has talked for decades about the very wealthy who are not philanthropists. You know that there are philanthropists all over the place, and they're not all multi-billionaires. There are people who recognize, I can give a bit. Sometimes they have an estate worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they earmark a significant portion of that for the kinds of services and whatever that you're talking about. Volunteers, find more variety in housing, and let's talk about it. The things that you have done, David, I haven't read about them at all. Why? They're not picked up in the mainstream media, and people my age are struggling with computers, much less trying to keep track of all the different social media entities.
We do try and get them to cover it, but
Yeah, I know.
It's their choice.
The question is, how can you get governments to do what every homeowner has to do, and that is look carefully at the priorities you set for your expenditure and keep those priorities in focus, not be swayed unfairly by a few noisy people, whether they're on social media or whether they're very wealthy. Get a focus and keep to it. That's my question. How do you do it?
Well, I think we all do that at the ballot box. Like that's one of the things I've seen in politics is that the language that politicians understand is election results. And I think if more and more people are saying, actually, you should be accountable to us, not to vested interests, not to your donors. You need to be making decisions that are good for us, or else I'm going to vote for someone else. I think that's when we'll see change. And I certainly see a bunch of independents who are pushing the major parties hard on a range of issues, and to the point where independents get accused of being a party, but that's just because we're listening to Australians and we're facing similar challenges across the country. So, yeah, I guess it's something we're doing every day. I'm doing every day in the Senate, really trying to raise these issues and push the government, both the major parties, really. Or we can't let either of them off the hook, because a housing crisis doesn't happen overnight. This is 25 years in the making.
I just wanted to hop in, if I could, and say thank you for being a volunteer, and thank you to everyone who is a volunteer. That is an essential fabric of our society, a tool that we cannot do without. It is remarkable where volunteers and philanthropy actually come from. Per capita, the most giving in Canberra comes from Charnwood. You would think it came from Forrest or Deakin, but no. And that's a figure I remember reporting on a long time ago in my years at the ABC, when we were very focused on all sorts of things that mattered. However, let's move on from that. Thank you. But I also want to throw this figure to you. The ATO says that of the people who have a taxable income of above $1 million in this country, only about 40 or 50% claim tax deductions for charitable giving. Now, that's structurally really, really problematic. That is something where you can do some levers of policy to make some changes in the tax structures. In fact, the rates of giving in the US are in fact much higher at the top end because the tax structures are really favourable towards them. But can you imagine having $1 million worth of taxable income and just not getting around to giving? That is an extraordinary thing. And again, that's the fractioning of society that I think is a really regrettable trend away from our much more egalitarian and much more fair go focused community standards.
If I can add just a couple of points, it's that, you know, volunteering, I think, helps people see each other's humanity better. It stems partly from recognizing a real need in the community, but then it also gives people the advantage of seeing other people. And I'd argue that philanthropy is the same, that the act of giving makes you focus your mind on your need relative to someone else's and see that yours isn't always coming on top. So we talked about what we can do. And certainly I've laid a lot at the feet of the government for action, and I think that's entirely appropriate. But the individual actions of everyone in this room also make a real difference.
I'm seeing, as the Canberra Day Appeal ticks away, we've got a ticker on the side, gee, there's a lot of $10 and $20 donations, and I just love seeing that. I love seeing people with a note to whether it's neonatal intensive care or Pegasus or Vinnie's or whoever it is, people saying, thank you. This is what I can give. It's all of our gifts and all of our talents. That's what makes us a stronger and more connected community.
I'll just give a little reminder before I go to the next person. If we can try to keep the questions tight and with a question mark at the end, I would love it.
Thank you. I'd like to hear a bit more about the reform on the income side for government, particularly around taxation reform. Is there any real prospect of reform in the Parliament around issues around negative gearing, capital gains tax? Why won't Parliament move on things that are quite obviously major impediments or distortions in the budget?
I don't know. You should ask Ken Henry sometime. It really, I find it astounding that tax is so taboo. Like you can't talk about it. And we already saw, like in the last week of Parliament, the coalition used up a whole bunch of their questions in Senate and the House question time, getting the government to go on the record that they aren't going to make any changes to tax should they win the election, which just seems nuts. Surely we'd be actually looking at the evidence and say, well, housing doesn't exactly seem to be working for us. What changes should we be making? So I don't know. Like I honestly think the only way that we're going to see movement on things like sensible changes to the way we tax or don't tax investment properties, to gambling, advertising, reform, lobbyists in Parliament House, release of ministerial diaries, all these things that constantly the whole crossbench gets voted against by the major parties is through a minority government. Allegra Spender's done a lot of work on tax, huge amount of consultation. I was involved in a bunch of her roundtables, and she released a green paper, which is worth checking out if you're passionate about tax, and really kind of just sets out what we're heading towards if we don't make changes. We're becoming overly reliant on personal income tax. The tax system isn't working for us, and particularly as we have an ageing population and the proportion of people who are sort of retired to working is changing. Some serious problems ahead, and yet we have the major parties saying no, we can't touch this broken system for fear of being wedged by the other. So I don't know, Laurie. I'd love to see them engage in a good debate, and you know, I guess this is one of the things that I say to people who say, well, what can an independent do anyway? You know, what can you do in there? And I think the first thing you can do is actually just engage in good faith in these sorts of debates that matter, and not just oppose them for opposition's sake. So I think it's something we desperately need to get on with as a country. And one of the things I've tried to do, say on housing, is actually suggest some middle-of-the-road, sensible ways to start to turn this ship around. I worked with Senator Jackie Lambie. We got a whole range of things costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office. And the one that actually makes a lot of sense when you take into account our current tax system and then the politics of it is a system where you just grandfather existing arrangements and you say, people made these investments, whether you agree with the rules or not, they were the rules, people made those investments, they can keep it till they sell. Going forward, you only get the capital gains tax discount on new builds, which is to incentivise supply, because that's what the major parties always say, oh, it's just all about supply, supply, supply. And then you limit negative gearing to one investment property. Because 70% of Australians only have one investment property, but it's something like 1% of Australians own 25% of property in this country. So it's just totally skewed. And there's people just milking the system, really. That seems pretty sensible. I haven't met too many people who say, oh no, that's a really radical change. And so I don't think it has to be, well, we just keep it as it is or just scrap everything. We can say, well, let's actually start to change things.
Firstly, thank you to the panel for tonight. It's been really good, really insightful. So I think I heard the figure of that Australians have spent $31 billion on gambling this year, or
at least I think it's 31 or 32.
And it's more than the government spends on aged care,
Yeah.
which is simply incredible.
Yeah.
So can you remind us of what steps you've taken in the Parliament to get that reformed, and what you'll do after the election, presuming you get voted back in?
Thank you. I mean, yeah, this is a huge issue. We are the biggest losers in the world per capita when it comes to gambling. And we've just seen a tragic lack of political leadership and courage from the Prime Minister on this issue. Quick background, everyone knows it's an issue. The government actually set up a inquiry into it, led by the late Peter Murphy. They looked at it, did some really amazing work. Like, there's some clips sort of on YouTube and floating around the internet of her really taking some of these gambling CEOs to task over their business model, what they're doing to Australians. That committee then made 32 recommendations, unanimously supported across the Parliament. Not a single party or parliamentarian read it and said, no, I don't like this, I'm going to make some additional comments or a dissenting report. It's a roadmap that is basically treating a public health issue as a public health response to a public health issue. It's harm minimisation. The big one that everyone's talked about is banning gambling ads fully over 3 years to give sports time to find other sponsors and other arrangements. And I guess this is something the crossbench has pushed hard on for the last 2 years. At every turn we've been pushing. We've held, I think, Lincoln and Geo, who do social media, are sick of the amount of the number of press conferences we've done, pushing the government to do more estimates. I've asked questions. A couple of lower house MPs actually have bills that would deliver on it. So it's one of those issues we'll just keep pushing, because this really matters to so many Australians and just doesn't make sense. And I guess you see up front, up close, the effect that vested interests have, right? These gambling companies, the AFL, the NRL, direct access to the Prime Minister, and unfortunately the Prime Minister sort of parroting lines directly from the gambling industry, which is pretty tragic given what's at stake. And so I guess in the next, should I be re-elected, I'm going to keep pushing and hope, a little bit biased as independent, hopefully there's a minority government, and this is something that everyone will be pushing.
Hello, thank you so much for having today. It's been great so far. I'm a health professional that's been working in health in Australia and New South Wales for 27 years. And one group that I've noticed is becoming really more and more vulnerable are single, older females. So they're falling into the poverty line. Many of these women have escaped domestic violence, but not even having to have escaped domestic violence. They've worked their whole lives or been in a caregiver role. They don't have a lot of super. They can't afford to live on their own, so they end up in situations in share houses that are really unsafe, or they end up homeless, and they can't afford to enter aged care facilities that would be safe or appropriate. So I think we all know that, you know, increasing payments and all the community support systems and services are important, but what are the legislative steps that would help this vulnerable group?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the last few years it's been the fastest growing cohort of homeless people in this country is women over 55. I think maybe this last year was overtaken by young people, but yeah, a huge issue. And I guess legislative changes, there have been in the last few housing bills that went through specific mentions to that cohort. Because I think, as you said, they're just falling through the cracks. The system isn't actually set up. And so I think, you know, specific investment in social housing, affordable housing that is available to that cohort is one way. But yeah, Devin, do you want to add anything from ACCOS's?
Well, I think, you know, to a large extent, older women are finding themselves in these positions, particularly because they were mothers and they did not have the income and the super investment that they otherwise would have. And so the net result is that as a society, we're turfing our mothers into the street. So reform to the pension, reform to superannuation, I think are mechanisms where we can do that less.
I just want to add that there's also an important part of the social licence here. There's been some projects here in the ACT for specifically targeted at exactly that cohort. I was having this discussion with Francis Crimmins from the YWCA just the other day, and there's been some really big efforts made to try to accommodate those people. Francis was telling me about objections from the neighbours. And she said you would be astonished that you would think that women over 55, a number of them escaping violence, would be the least difficult cohort imaginable. And she said to me, you'd also be shocked at who was leading the resistance. I just want to put a plug in here for the importance of the ACT continuing salt and pepper public housing, continuing the idea that we are all one community, that public housing, social housing occurs across our entire community. I live in Lyneham, and in Wattle Street we go from me down the bottom near the shops, there's some public housing in the middle, Katie Gallagher lives up at the top. I reckon that's really good. I think we need to have that kind of community where we have a responsibility towards housing people who, as Devin says, have given their lives towards caring.
If I can add one last point, it's that the ACT actually, the barriers to putting forward an objection to social housing, for instance, being built, are lower than in any other jurisdiction. And so the reason, you know, the YWCA faced all those challenges could be fixed with ACT-based legislation that basically says, if you're trying to put in social housing, then let's make it not easy for your neighbors to object on the grounds that basically they don't want those people living there, right? Like we can change that pretty easily.
And it's kind of surprising that those changes have not been made in this particular jurisdiction.
I guess on a policy thing, you know, there's much longer term things around paid parental leave, super on that, all those sorts of issues, but that's obviously not going to help that cohort now.
Yeah, g'day Senator. Question around housing. and supply in new builds. When you were trying to get a new build out of the ground, approximately, depending on the size and scale of the build or the project, about 50%, between 40-50% of the cost can be taken up by taxes and different application fees, from the way GST is applied at a federal level to the entire supply chain, to development costs and approval from local councils, state governments. With the gap between income and house prices rising, is there any real appetite, or is there an appetite, say, at a federal level to address that red tape, that the need, well, not necessarily unnecessary taxing, but the overtaxation of a process that can deliver lower housing to more affordable levels, especially to younger people, so that that gap isn't quite as wide?
I think we've got to find ways. This is certainly one of the biggest things that gets raised with me by builders in the ACT is just how long it takes, and if you're in that industry, time is money. We have to find ways, and this is obviously an issue of federation, a federated model, but there's ways, well, I argue to the federal government that there's ways that they can actually attach some strings to big buckets of money around infrastructure to actually put the heat on territory government, which surely we can do it here. We've got one level of government. You don't have councils involved. So it seems like this is something that we should be able to solve here in the ACT. But yeah, I hear you on that one. And I guess on top of that, there's some pretty inefficient taxes levied at a state and territory level, payroll tax, stamp duties, which really just comes down to revenue raising. And so I think, again, talk about revenue at the federal level, I think there's potentially a way to try and substitute some of those revenue streams with potentially with other ones that are more efficient. But yeah, it's kind of squarely a territory issue. So I've been advocating for them to try and apply some pressure because it's having a huge impact here in the ACT.
One additional point I'd make is that it's really tempting for a government to tax building because we have made, through our tax policy, real estate such a dominant vehicle of wealth creation. And so what we've done is to prioritize real estate as an investment class rather than as a human right. And then, as a result of that, it becomes this tempting honeypot that we seem as governments have real difficulty avoiding tapping into. So I think if we are to reform the way in which we as a country treat real estate and how we tax it when you're holding it as an investment rather than as a dwelling for yourself and your family, then its attraction as a honeypot will decline, and there will perhaps be greater opportunity to implement some more efficient and fairer tax measures.
And it is a really difficult one in the ACT for government to avoid because we have such an undiversified tax base. We've got so few sources of revenue in the ACT, and so the vulnerability and the sheer heft of the ACT property sector. And I was at a property council lunch today. They've actually been very generous to Hands Across Canberra. I thank them for that. They should be very generous towards us, which is great. Someone said to me, "My God, you got them to give you some money. That's amazing." I said, "Yeah, fantastic." But I think there's a sort of a crippling sort of catch-22 going on here, that the sector is one of the biggest economic drivers that the ACT has. And so long as that is the case, along with GST allocation, there's very little incentive, as Devin says, to vary from the current structures.
One thing which I was curious about coming into this, for me, one of the biggest financial impacts I have every year is paying for insurance. It absorbs most of a paycheck, essentially, in order to be able to pay for it for the year at my age especially. I was wondering if there was any movement based around affecting that sort of area, basically making that a bit more accessible, being able to get good insurance for a car or something.
I had a mobile office a while back, and someone brought in their bill, their home insurance, home and contents insurance bill, and it had gone up, I think 25%, something like that. She'd printed another page that had, I think it was, I won't say it because I'll get it wrong, but the insurer's company sort of yearly profits, which had gone up like 24%. And so I think you've got to ask some questions about that. And there has been some talk about just how concentrated the sort of insurance market is, and potentially the need for more competition. I think that's a valid thing to look at. I think the bigger issue is around climate change and climate risk, and you simply can't insure yourself out of a climate crisis. So I think the government is going to have to be more proactive. I don't know what that actually looks like, but both in terms of, I guess, where we're building and where we're not building as a start. Not building on floodplains, not building in places that we know will potentially be inundated. But then I guess, more broadly, whether there's a role for the government to step in. It's a big issue. I think it is. It's so expensive, and I think with this cyclone heading towards southeast Queensland, northern New South Wales, we know that there's a huge number of people who would be uninsured, and so what will that mean when we're living in a world where we're seeing more and more of these events which hike the price of insurance, so less people are insured, and it's a pretty scary prospect. But it's not a very good answer for you, but certainly something that I can look into more. Thanks for raising it.
Insurance is our way of collectivizing risk. And with climate change, we're facing collectively a great deal more risk, and that's only going to increase. Right now, we're effectively letting insurance companies dictate how we collectively engage with that risk, because they're putting up premiums and then telling some of us, well, your house isn't insurable. And that's, I think, going to see more people fall off the Canberra cliff, which won't just be the Canberra cliff. I mean, as you point out, there are almost certainly going to be thousands of families that fall off the southeast Queensland cliff. And so I think there is role for government here to really be leading a conversation about our collective risk. And maybe to do that, it needs to start playing in the insurance game itself, so that it has a more direct stake, but also policy. So one thing that astounds me is that places that have been flooded more than once, people continue to rebuild there. And I can absolutely understand that impulse, but if we're going to collectively deal with the increased risk from climate change, we need them to not do that anymore.
And maybe we just don't let people build those houses on the other side of the Murrumbidgee where the fires will come roaring out of the Brindabellas and obliterate them. That'd be a good idea as well.
Yeah, and I mean, on Devin's point, there have been some, I think, fairly sensible people pushing for a sort of polluter pays levy or tax of some sort on big fossil fuel companies to actually start to build up a pot of money to be used in, a scheme of some sorts around insurance.
I've got another question asker over here, but if you can just raise your hand if you want to ask a question so I can reset the queue in my mind, that'd be great. Thank you.
Hey guys, I've been working in the youth sector for about 16 years with youth at risk, and you're saying is that the short-term answer to raise the youth allowance and job seeker? Is that like the short-term answer? What would be the long-term answer? Because the reason I say that is because I've worked with youth that said, "Oh, I'll just be on the dole like mum and dad." We've able to change their mindset, get them a job as a barber, and now they're like trying to help change like the kids that they work with. I mean, they're like their siblings. So like, yeah, we can raise that price. And I came from housing myself, single mother and stuff like that. But is that the answer? Like, what's the actual answer like after that? You raise the price, do you get things in there to help change people's mindset, start a business, like get out of that, I guess, poverty line? Like, what's the answer after raising the price if you get that? Like, how can we help these people actually become businessmen of Canberra, women, and probably give back like I've been able to do, like start my own business and give back to these things? But like raising that, I guess, price, what's the answer after that for all these young kids that, don't really have much to look up to but their parents in and out of jail, drug addicts and stuff like that?
Well, firstly, thanks for the work you're doing. So impressive. The other, I guess, half of the conversation that has been going on around raising the rate is, I guess, the wraparound services that should come with that. Currently, we have this system of sort of mutual obligations that is basically we pay private companies to get people to tick some boxes saying they're applying for jobs so that they can get payments. It doesn't seem to be working. And there's a lot of scope to actually be doing the sorts of things you're doing, working with people to help resolve issues or get some training. And there's a whole bunch of countries, particularly some of the Nordic countries, that do this much, much better than us, which is probably no surprise. So I think, it's about imagination and actually thinking, well, how do you deal with this? Do you have anything to...
I was just going to say, it's a small cohort of people who've got a whole lot of other things going on in their lives, isn't it? I don't think anyone wants to be... Most people don't want to be stuck on the dole. Most people don't want to live that life cycle where they're receiving benefit payments. But for those people who are in that cycle, it's about digging deeper and understanding what the factors are that would lead people to that place. And that's often a really sort of hard thing to resolve. I certainly remember hearing many years ago, I've interviewed lots and lots of ACT police chiefs over the years, and that the number of people who are sort of regular visitors, frequent flyers in jail, is quite a small proportion of the Canberra community. And there's quite a multi-generational thing, but it's really hard to break that nexus. I don't have an answer, but I think that's kind of what you're getting at, that it's not just the price point thing, it's what the deeper social issues are that are pushing people in that direction. Devin, have you got some thoughts?
Yeah, and this would be a place where the community sector as a whole and volunteers as a whole absolutely have a role. Yeah. And if, on some level, what poverty does is it takes up all your time. It's exhausting to be poor. It takes all of your time. And so lifting the rate helps people address that. But it also tells them that they are valuable on some level. And that's something that money alone is not going to do, although we do have a very money-focused society in some respects. But that is where the community sector and where volunteers play, I think, a really important role. And so I'm sure in your work as a youth worker, much of that is connecting with a young person and seeing value in that person. And so, again, thank you for that work. That's an absolutely essential component. And everyone would rather feel valuable and feel like they do have something to contribute and then go contribute it.
One of the things that we can do if we really get sort of the community work in the not-for-profit sector right is we can start to invest in things that are sort of way upstream. a lot of the issues that we have at the moment with charities, certainly in Canberra, and we work with at Hands Across Canberra with 350 charities, people are so head down, bum up, desperately trying to solve the problems that there isn't the time or the resources to do things that are bigger and go back further. And so if we had mechanisms to be able to invest in problem solving with kids who are starting to get into trouble at school, with families where there are signs of difficulties, with things where there is early intervention and much more comprehensive wraparound. But we just don't have those resources as a whole in this community. And that's why I suggest to you that community foundations, for example, and that level of investment, building strong partnerships so there's another lever to pull, that's actually a really critically important thing we can do. I don't want in 5 or 6 years' time in the job that I'm doing to be continuing to just give relatively small grants to lots of different people so they can afford to do this small thing. I would like us to be investing in saying, can we end youth homelessness? Can we do something big that we've all got the resources to do as a partnership?
Hi. Just going back to the thing about the dental in Medicare and that, is there scope, do you think, to have a graduated response and maybe covering under 18s, bringing back the school visits, sort of touching, I guess, tying into the last question, similar to, as we've seen, with an eye is an eye, well, a mouth is a mouth, and if that's at the school visit, your mouth is just as important as the kid whose parents can afford the dentist every week. The kids learn that, develop that culture in terms of protecting their own dental health, self-esteem. They're valued as much as everyone else. So the on-flow effects of that, so not just the face of actually fixing the teeth problems, get them early and reduce that burden of dental problems in adulthood, and maybe approaching it that way, especially returning to the school visits at least. I think as much as the cost, fear and shame is a hurdle to visiting a dentist.
It's a great question. I actually met with, I'm trying to think who on the team was, met with a psychiatrist who's retrained, no, a dentist who's gone and retrained as a psychiatrist and is working on kind of the impact of dental hygiene with mental health, and so passionate about seeing more young people have access to it. We do still have a national scheme that is means tested for children. I've asked the Parliamentary Library to write me a brief, so I'll be able to tell you a bit more in a little while, but I think you're right. Like that should be accessible. And again, if it is a huge sort of budget concern for the major parties, I think most people would say, okay, well, let's look at some sort of means testing as a first step, so people who genuinely can't afford to see a dentist can. And you'd obviously start with kids, but either of you have anything to add on that? No. But thank you. If you want to give someone your details, we can definitely check back in with you when I know more.
Thank you, Senator, for organising this town hall. My question goes to Genevieve, and thank you to both of our speakers here tonight. Genevieve, you mentioned, I think, the requirement for a food bank. Now, we have several small ones. I mean, there's Food Bank, ACT, New South Wales. I'm not sure what we get out of that. Oz Harvest and St John Care are some that come to mind. And then when you mentioned foundations, you mentioned the idea of doing something big. Can you elaborate on the food bank idea, and also can you give us some idea of how short we are in food security at that sort of level? Are we 50%, 20%, 10% of the way there? What are we looking at?
Look, I'd struggle to give you a figure, but I can tell you that it's growing, that it's significantly growing. What we've got at the moment is a whole patchwork of attempts to solve the food security problem. And we've got a bunch of people. We've got the Salvos, we've got Vinnie's, we've got Oz Harvest, we've got the street pantries, we've got Helping ACT, we've got things like Holy Cross at Hackett, which is a food co-op. We've got a whole bunch of things that are happening. And what I'm trying to work on with Muhammad Ali And those of you who know Muhammad Ali from Helping ACT will know that he is just an unstoppable force, and that he and I together are making quite a lot of headway, which is quite good. What I'm really looking for is a place. I think there needs to be a central axis for food supply. I'm talking at the moment to a developer, and I've said to him, I need a concrete slab and a shipping container and some electricity, and we need a structure around that. So if there was a central place where there could be food storage in Canberra, where people who are small operators could come and share in that, perhaps in a cooperative model, that's what I'm envisaging. And I'm being challenged to be able to think of that and iterate it out in a 5-year and then a 10-year plan to where we need to get to. But one of the things that happens in this food supply question, and it happens a lot in the not-for-profit world, is that people step up with huge passion and huge generosity, and then they burn out because they don't have the resources and they don't have the backup to make it work. And I've seen this as a journalist and in the not-for-profit sector over and over and over again. So you need to back them in. You need to say there's a structure around you that can help you access food at discount prices, where you can store your food, where you're not doing it on the lawn and annoying the neighbours necessarily, where those kinds of things can actually make the whole thing more coherent. I was really shocked that Helping ACT is now providing breakfast programs to, I think, 8 schools, most of them Southside. I just am horrified that in a city as wealthy as this, we have children going to school hungry in the mornings for multiple reasons. But it's a real and it's a growing problem. Kirsty from Tuckerbox at Hackett tells me that the oldest person that uses her food co-op is 96. 96 and relying on a food co-op. She has to triage the fresh vegetables when she puts them out, step them out, because if she put them all out at once, there would be nothing left. That's how urgent the problem is. And her clientele have increased from having about 25% of their weekly food needs met by the co-op to 80 to 90% of their weekly food needs met by the co-op. So it's a real problem, and I'm horrified, but I reckon if we can get a central facility, it's a starting point.
I think one of the issues is that as need has really increased quite dramatically in a few years' time, what's happened is that the solutions that were, sort of from the ground up have been stretched to a point that we need a degree of systematic coordination. And I think we clearly need more funding in that space. So this is one of the sort of growing pains, I guess, of almost needing like a phase change, if that makes sense. It's a real issue, and it shows what happens when cost of living pressures are as bad as they are now.
We're pretty much at 7:30. We just wanted to run through a few slides with sort of practical assistance. If you or anyone you know is looking for support, as we've discussed, there are some incredible organisations and people in this town doing everything they can, often doing more with less, as we've heard around funding. So we've got food pantries, housing, again, essentials and energy. Some amazing organisations there. Get in touch with them. There's also sort of the helplines and other places you can check out. On top of that, whenever I meet with the banks, I'm always asking them what they're doing for people who are in mortgage stress. The thing they stress is get in touch early. So if you know anyone who is concerned or not able to make repayments, tell them to contact their bank as soon as possible to try and work something out. So I think that's, thank you all so much. Really appreciate you coming out. I've don't know when the election's going to be. This may or may not be my last town hall, but I've just loved engaging with Canberrans and seeing how much people love this place and want to see it better looked after, want better decisions made for the long term. So thank you all so much, and please join with me in thanking Genevieve and Devin for being here. And if you have a question or something that you want to give us feedback, there's too many people in Team Pocock t-shirts now, I can't say. Maybe if people stand up. There's Sam up the back, Lincoln, Natasha, and Claire. If you want to talk to Claire about volunteering, she's the person to talk to. So thank you all so much. We'll be hanging around and chatting if you want to stay behind. Thanks.